Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a simple but powerful truth. Your brain is not passive. It is always paying attention. Every thought you repeat, every inner sentence you whisper to yourself is being recorded, interpreted, and turned into instructions. Whether you realize it or not, you are constantly teaching your brain how to feel, how to act, and what kind of future to expect. Your brain is not something that waits for instructions from the outside world first, always listening inward before it responds outward. Every thought you think is like a quiet command, and the brain responds instantly, not with logic or judgment, but with obedience. It does not stop to ask whether the thought is helpful or harmful, true or outdated. It simply listens, records, and begins to organize itself around that message. This is happening whether you are aware of it or not, whether you believe it or not, whether you want it or not. From the moment you wake up in the morning, your internal dialogue begins. The thoughts you repeat about yourself, about your day, about what you expect, immediately tell your brain what kind of reality it should prepare you for. If the first thoughts are rushed, stressed, or defeated, the brain activates the same familiar circuits it has practiced thousands of times before. It says, "This is who we are today." And the body follows. Muscles tense, breathing changes, hormones shift, all because of a thought that lasted only seconds. Your brain learns through repetition. The thoughts you think most often become the thoughts your brain believes are important. Over time, these thoughts stop feeling like choices and start feeling like facts. You don't even question them anymore. You say things like, "This is just how I am," or "This always happens to me," without realizing that your brain has been trained to expect and recreate those experiences. The brain loves familiarity, even when familiarity comes with pain or limitation. You think leaves a physical trace. Neural connections strengthen with use, just like muscles grow with exercise. When you think the same thought again and again, your brain builds a stronger pathway for it. Soon that thought becomes automatic. It fires before you can stop it. And when a thought becomes automatic, it quietly runs your life. You react the same way, choose the same patterns, and feel the same emotions, all because the brain has memorized that internal script. Most people don't realize is that the brain does not know the difference between an actual experience and a vividly imagined one. When you replay past failures, worries, or fears in your mind, the brain responds as if those events are happening now. The body releases the same chemicals. The nervous system reacts the same way, and the brain reinforces the same pathways. We're literally teaching your brain to live in the past while your body believes it is happening in the present. This is why change feels so uncomfortable at first. The moment you try to think differently, the brain resists. Not because the new thought is wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. The brain prefers what it knows. It prefers the old story, the old identity, emotional state. When you challenge that pattern, the brain sends signals of discomfort, doubt, and resistance, hoping you will return to what feels safe. Most people give up here, thinking something is wrong, when in reality something new is beginning. Awareness is the turning point. The moment you observe your thoughts instead of becoming them, you create separation. You realize you are not your thoughts, you are the one listening to them. That realization alone changes the relationship between you and your brain. Instead of being controlled by unconscious patterns, you begin to interrupt them. Each interruption weakens the old pathway and creates the possibility for a new one. When you intentionally choose a new thought, even if it feels unnatural at first, your brain starts to pay attention. It notices the repetition. It begins to rewire. With enough consistency, the brain accepts the new thought as relevant, starts building around it. Over time, what once felt forced begins to feel familiar. Feels familiar begins to feel like who you are. Your brain is always learning from you. It listens to the way you speak to yourself when no one else is around. It listens to the stories you repeat about your past. It listens to the expectations you carry about your future. And it uses that information to shape your perceptions, your behaviors, and your emotional responses. You are not waiting for life to change you. You are constantly changing your brain with every thought you think, every moment you stay unconscious or become aware, every time you repeat the same inner dialogue or choose to gently shift it. Because the brain is always listening, always adapting, always becoming what you repeatedly tell it to be. Even in the quiet moments when you think nothing is happening and your mind drifts back to the same familiar thoughts. Again and again, shaping tomorrow from the inside out without you even realizing it is happening in that very moment. Your thoughts are not silent events happening in isolation. The moment a thought appears, it sends a signal through the brain. Signal immediately triggers a response in the body. This is not philosophy or metaphor. It is a living process happening every second of your life. The brain translates thought into chemistry and chemistry into feeling. That feeling then reinforces the thought, creating a loop that becomes your internal environment. Most people live inside this loop without ever realizing they are the ones generating it. The brain's primary job is prediction. It's constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next so it can keep you safe and efficient. To do that, it relies heavily on your most frequent thoughts. If your inner dialogue is dominated by worry, the brain predicts danger. Your thoughts are focused on lack, the brain prepares for scarcity. The body follows those predictions by adjusting hormones, posture, breathing, and focus. Over time, this predictive state becomes your baseline. Start to feel that this is just how life feels. Emotion is the language the brain uses to make thoughts feel real. A thought without emotion passes quickly. A thought charged with emotion leaves an imprint. When you emotionally react to your own thinking, telling your brain that this thought matters. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the signal. This is why emotionally charged thoughts are remembered longer and repeated more often. The brain prioritizes them, builds stronger networks around them, the easier to access in the future. Most people believe their emotions are caused by external events, but in reality, emotions are the result of how the brain interprets those events through thought. Two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different emotions. The difference is not the event, it is the thought attached to it. The brain responds to meaning, not circumstance. Change the meaning, and the brain changes the response. When the same emotional thoughts are repeated daily, the body becomes conditioned to them. Stress, for example, stops being a reaction and becomes a personality trait. The body memorizes the chemical state associated with certain thoughts and begins to crave it when it is uncomfortable. This is why people often return to familiar emotional states without knowing why. The brain has learned that this is normal, and normal feels safe. As the body becomes accustomed to certain emotional patterns, influence thinking in return. The chemistry of the body sends signals back to the brain, subtly guiding thought in the same direction. This creates a closed loop where thoughts create feelings and feelings create more of the same thoughts. Point, it can feel like you are trapped in your own mind, reacting automatically instead of choosing consciously. Breaking this cycle requires understanding that a thought is just a signal, not a command. The moment you pause and notice what you are thinking, you interrupt the automatic process. That pause may feel uncomfortable because the brain is no longer running on autopilot. It doesn't like unpredictability. But in that moment of discomfort, you reclaim authority over your inner world. Choosing a new thought changes the signal. At first, the body may not respond the way you expect. The chemistry may lag behind the intention. This is normal. The brain has been trained through repetition. Retraining takes consistency. Each time you choose a thought that aligns with clarity, strength, or possibility, you send a new instruction. The brain begins to adjust slowly at first, then more efficiently as repetition continues. With time, the emotional begins to change. The body starts to experience different chemical states, and those states feel unfamiliar but refreshing. The brain notices this shift and starts to associate the new thoughts with a different internal reward. Eventually, once felt forced begins to feel natural. The loop rewires itself. Your inner world is not shaped by what happens to you, but by what you consistently think about what happens to you. The brain listens to patterns, not intentions. Responds to what you practice mentally, not what you hope will change. Every time you repeat a thought, you reinforce a direction. Every time you emotionally react to that thought, you deepen the pathway. This means you are always signaling your future through your present thinking. The brain is taking notes, adjusting its wiring, refining its predictions. It is learning who you believe you are, what you expect from life, and how you think the world works. It is shaping your perception to match those beliefs, filtering reality to confirm them, strengthening the same emotional responses day after day, moment after moment, quietly building a version of you that matches the thoughts you return to most often. Your brain is always working to create coherence between what you think and how you live. It is constantly asking one question beneath your awareness die: does your inner world match your outer behavior? When it finds a match, it reinforces it. When it doesn't, for the fastest way to restore familiarity. This is why thinking differently without changing how you feel or act can feel exhausting. The brain is trying to protect consistency, not growth. Most people believe their thoughts are reactions to life. In truth, thoughts are rehearsals. You are constantly practicing versions of yourself in your mind before you ever act them out. The brain treats these mental rehearsals as real training. Every imagined conversation, every replayed memory, anticipated problem is shaping neural circuits. The brain doesn't wait for proof. It prepares based on repetition. When you repeatedly think from the same identity, the brain locks into that identity. It learns your preferences, your fears, your emotional defaults. It becomes efficient at being the version of you that you think you are. Efficiency is the brain's goal. It wants to conserve energy by automating behavior. That is why change feels like effort. You are asking the brain to stop being efficient and start being intentional. Your sense of self is largely a collection of memorized thoughts. Thoughts about who you are, what you're capable of, what usually happens to you. The brain stores these as reference points and uses them to guide perception. When something new appears that challenges this identity, the brain often ignores it or explains it away. Not because the opportunity isn't real. It doesn't fit the existing internal model. This is why people can stand in front of new possibilities and not see them. The brain filters reality based on what it already knows, highlights what confirms your existing beliefs, and minimizes what contradicts them. If you believe life is a struggle, the brain will find evidence everywhere. If you believe you are limited, the brain will focus on obstacles instead of options. Filtering happens automatically long before conscious choice. To change this, you must become greater than the identity your brain has memorized. That begins by noticing the thoughts that define you. The quiet ones, the automatic ones, that sound like facts but are really habits. When you observe them without immediately believing them, you loosen their grip. The brain starts to realize that these thoughts are not commands but patterns. Creating a new identity requires repeated conscious thought, not wishful thinking, but deliberate inner direction. You must think from the perspective of who you are becoming, not who you have been. Feels unnatural at first because the brain has no reference for it. There is no established pathway. You are literally building new circuitry with attention and intention. The brain responds strongly to clarity. Vague thoughts create weak signals. Clear, specific thoughts create strong ones. When you clearly define how you want to think, feel, and act, the brain begins organizing around that vision. It starts looking for ways to support it. Focus sharpens perception. Intention directs energy. Repetition strengthens structure. Emotion plays a critical role here. A thought without feeling is just noise. When you emotionally connect to a new way of thinking, you give the brain a reason to remember it. Elevated emotions signal importance. They tell the brain this matters, pay attention. Over time, the brain associates the new identity with a new emotional state, and that state begins to feel more natural. The body must come along for the change to last. You think new thoughts, but feel the same emotions. The body pulls you back to the familiar. The brain listens to the body's chemical feedback. When the body starts to feel aligned with the new thoughts, the brain accepts the change as real. This is when transformation stops being effort and starts becoming automatic. Every time you interrupt an old thought and choose a new one, you weaken the old network. Every time you feel a new emotion without an external reason, you are teaching your body to follow your mind instead of the environment. This is how internal change becomes embodied. The brain learns through experience, and internal experiences count. Over time, the new identity begins to feel familiar. The brain no longer resists it, it recognizes it. What once felt like pretending now feels like remembering. The thoughts become easier to access. The emotional state becomes more stable. The behaviors follow naturally. At this point, change is no longer something you are trying to do. It is something you are living. Your brain is not your enemy. It is a powerful instrument waiting for direction. It listens carefully, constantly, faithfully. It learns from what you repeat, what you feel, what you focus on. When you take responsibility for that inner direction, you stop living by habit and start living by design, and the brain, always attentive, continues adapting to the instructions you give it. In each moment, you choose to think differently, intentionally, and act in alignment with the version of yourself you are actively creating moment by moment, thought by thought, without needing permission from the past, without waiting for circumstances to change, while the brain quietly rewires itself in response to the signals you are now sending again and again through conscious awareness and deliberate inner choice, guiding it forward into unfamiliar territory where growth begins and familiarity slowly dissolves into something new. Something intentional, something aligned, something that is no longer driven by memory but by vision. Internal dialogue reshapes the structure of the mind from within, continuously, subtly, persistently, shaping perception, behavior, and experience as the process unfolds without pause, without conclusion, continuing as long as awareness remains present and the signal remains clear, guiding the brain forward into the unknown, responding faithfully to every thought you choose to think, every emotion you choose to feel. moment you choose to remain conscious rather than automatic, while the internal environment becomes the foundation for an entirely new way of being, still forming, still unfolding, still in motion, still becoming as the brain listens, adapts, and follows. Your brain is constantly shaping your future based on what you consistently focus on in the present. Attention is not neutral. Wherever you place it, energy follows, and the brain begins to organize itself around that direction. People don't realize their attention is being spent on the same thoughts every day, often without intention. Those thoughts become familiar, and familiarity becomes the blueprint the brain uses to predict what comes next. When you focus on a thought, brain amplifies it. It highlights related memories, emotions, and associations. One thought rarely travels alone. It pulls an entire network with it. A single idea about fear can activate years of stored experiences. A single thought about confidence can awaken dormant strengths. The brain works by association, not isolation, and attention is the switch that turns entire systems on or off. What you repeatedly focus on becomes what you notice in the world. The brain filters reality based on relevance, and relevance is determined by attention. If your focus is on problems, the brain becomes highly skilled at finding them. If your focus is on opportunities, the brain sharpens its ability to recognize them. Filtering happens automatically long before conscious awareness. You don't see reality as it is, you see reality as your brain has been trained to see it. Over time, sustained attention strengthens neural networks. The brain adapts to what you pay attention to most, making those pathways faster and more efficient. This efficiency can either work for you or against you. If your attention is locked into the past, the brain keeps recreating it. If your attention is anchored in worry, the brain keeps preparing for threat. But when attention is directed toward growth, learning, and possibility, the brain begins to reorganize toward expansion. Distraction is not just a loss of focus, a loss of direction. When attention is scattered, the brain receives mixed signals. It doesn't know what to prioritize, so it defaults to what is familiar. This is why moments of stillness and clarity are so powerful. When you consciously direct your attention, you give the brain a clear signal. Clarity reduces noise. Focus creates order. The brain does not change through force. It changes through repetition of attention. Trying to overpower old patterns rarely works. Gently and consistently redirecting attention begins to weaken them. Each time you notice where your mind has wandered and bring it back intentionally, you are training the brain. That act alone builds awareness. Awareness is the foundation of transformation. Attention also influences emotional states. When you dwell on a thought long enough, emotion follows. The brain interprets sustained attention as importance. It responds by activating emotional and chemical responses that match the focus. This is why prolonged attention on gratitude can elevate mood, and prolonged attention on resentment can drain energy. The brain aligns emotion with focus, creating a feedback loop that reinforces both. As emotions intensify, they further lock attention in place. Strong emotions narrow focus. The brain becomes less flexible, more rigid. This is why people feel stuck when emotional patterns dominate their attention. Breaking this cycle requires gently expanding awareness. When you observe the emotion without feeding it more attention, its intensity begins to soften. The brain receives a new signal. This no longer requires full focus. Learning to direct attention is learning to direct the brain. This skill is not about control, but about choice. Each moment offers an opportunity to choose where your attention goes. That choice may feel small, but its impact compounds over time. Brain is always listening for patterns, and attention is one of the strongest patterns you can offer. When attention is aligned with intention, the brain becomes a powerful ally. It begins to anticipate outcomes that match your focus. Prepares you mentally and emotionally for the direction you are consistently pointing toward. This preparation shapes behavior subtly. You make different choices, notice different details, respond differently to the same situations. All because attention has shifted. Sustained attention on a future vision begins to make it feel familiar. Familiarity reduces fear. As the brain becomes comfortable with the idea of something new, resistance fades. What once felt distant starts to feel possible. Brain doesn't distinguish between focus on what is and focus on what could be. It responds to both as training data. This is why imagination, when paired with focused attention, is so powerful. When you repeatedly place attention on a desired internal state, the neural foundation for that experience. Over time, the internal experience starts to influence the external one. Perception shifts, behavior aligns. The brain adjusts its expectations. The key is consistency. Attention given once has little impact. Attention given daily reshapes the mind. It is not dramatic moments, but quiet repetition that changes the brain structure. Each return of attention is a vote for the person you are becoming. The brain counts those votes carefully. You are always training your brain, whether consciously or unconsciously. Every moment of focus is instruction. Every moment of awareness is guidance. When you begin to recognize this, attention becomes sacred. You no longer give it away carelessly. You begin to place it where you want your life to grow, where your mind can expand, where your inner world can stabilize and evolve, while the brain faithfully responds to the direction you continue to offer. Moment after moment, as attention becomes intention, intention becomes structure, and structure becomes experience, still forming, still reorganizing, still adapting as the process continues uninterrupted, guided by focus, shaped by awareness, unfolding internally while the brain remains alert, responsive, and ready to follow wherever attention leads. Your brain is deeply influenced by the words you use internally, even more than the words you speak out loud. Inner language shapes perception before reality ever reaches conscious awareness. Every sentence you repeat in your mind becomes a directive. The brain treats those words as instructions, not opinions. It listens closely, translates language into meaning, meaning into experience. This process happens automatically, silently, and continuously. The way you speak to yourself creates an internal environment. If that environment is critical, rushed, or heavy, the brain adapts to survive in it. It sharpens defense mechanisms, heightens alertness, and narrows perception. Over time, this becomes the default operating system. You may think you are just being realistic or cautious. The brain interprets repetitive internal language as truth and prepares the body accordingly. Words carry emotional weight. Certain phrases trigger instant reactions because the brain has learned to associate them with past experiences. When you tell yourself, "I can't," the brain doesn't analyze the statement. It recalls every moment connected to limitation and reinforces that pattern. The body responds with hesitation, fatigue, or tension, all before you consciously decide how to act. Internal language also defines identity. The phrases you use to describe yourself become labels the brain organizes around. When you repeatedly describe yourself in a certain way, the brain works to maintain coherence with that description, influences behavior to match the story. This is not because the story is accurate, but because consistency feels safe to the brain. Most people are unaware of how automatic their inner dialogue is. Thoughts arise, words form, meaning is assigned without question. The brain loves efficiency, so it reuses familiar language. Those reused phrases slowly harden into beliefs. Beliefs then act as filters, shaping how information is received and interpreted. Here are opportunities if your inner language is rooted in doubt. You don't recognize progress if your inner language is rooted in criticism. Changing internal language requires awareness before effort. You cannot force new words into a mind that is still unconscious of the old ones. The first step is noticing how you speak to yourself during ordinary moments, not just during challenges, but during routine tasks, quiet moments, transitions. The brain listens most closely when you think no one else is listening. When you interrupt an old internal phrase and choose a new one, the brain initially resists. It questions the unfamiliar language. It searches for evidence. This resistance is not failure, adjustment. The brain is recalibrating. With repetition, the new language begins to feel less foreign. The emotional response softens. The body relaxes into it. The brain starts accepting it as a viable instruction. The tone of your inner language matters as much as the words themselves. Harsh language creates contraction. Supportive language creates expansion. When the brain senses encouragement instead of pressure, it becomes more flexible. Learning accelerates. Creativity increases. Stress responses diminish. The brain performs better when it feels safe internally. Internal language also shapes how long emotional states last. Momentary setback can turn into a prolonged emotional state, depending on the words you attach to it. If the inner dialogue escalates the meaning, the brain amplifies the response. If the language is neutral or constructive, brain processes the event and moves on. Language determines duration. Over time, consistent internal language rewires emotional memory. The brain begins associating daily experiences with new interpretations. Once triggered frustration may now trigger curiosity. What once felt overwhelming may now feel manageable. This is not because life has changed, but because the internal translation has changed. The brain does not require perfection. It responds to direction. Even slight improvements in internal language send new signals. Replacing one limiting phrase with a neutral one begins the shift. The brain tracks these changes quietly, adjusting expectations, recalibrating responses, and reorganizing internal patterns. When internal language aligns with intention, the brain becomes an active participant in growth. It looks for confirmation. It supports behavior that matches the new narrative. Motivation increases not because you force it, because the internal environment is no longer hostile. The brain thrives in clarity. The most powerful conversations you will ever have are the ones you have with yourself. They happen constantly, shaping perception, guiding behavior, influencing emotion. The brain listens without interruption. It remembers everything you repeat. It builds around what you reinforce. As internal language becomes more intentional, awareness deepens. You catch subtle phrases before they spiral. You recognize patterns earlier. You respond instead of react. The brain learns that change is not a threat but a process. Safety is no longer tied to the past but to conscious choice. This is how inner dialogue becomes inner architecture. Words become signals. Signals become structure. Structure becomes experience. The brain continues adapting, responding faithfully to the language you choose to use internally, moment by moment, shaping identity, perception, and behavior as the internal voice grows clearer, steadier, more aligned with who you are becoming, while the mind reorganizes itself around these repeated instructions, absorbing tone, meaning, and intention, adjusting quietly, continuously without pause, following the direction of the words you choose to think. Internal world reshapes the external experience from the inside out again and again, still informing, still listening. Your brain is constantly responding to the emotional state you live in most often. Emotion is not just something you feel, a chemical signal that tells the brain who you are being. When an emotion is repeated, the brain assumes it is important and begins to organize your internal world around it. Over time, emotional states stop being reactions and start becoming traits. You don't just feel stressed or confident or disconnected, you begin to live there. Every emotion has a chemical signature. When you feel a certain way repeatedly, the body becomes accustomed to that chemistry. The brain notices this and adjusts its expectations. It begins to predict life through that emotional lens. If stress is familiar, the brain prepares for stress. If calm is rare, the brain treats it as unfamiliar. This is why some people feel uncomfortable when things finally slow down. The brain is not used to that chemical state and tries to pull the system back to what it knows. The brain and body are in constant communication. Thoughts trigger emotions, emotions trigger chemical responses, and those chemicals send feedback to the brain. When an emotional state is repeated often enough, the body memorizes it. The body then begins to influence the brain, subtly guiding thoughts that match the familiar chemistry. This is how emotional states can run on autopilot without conscious thought. Many people believe they are controlled by their emotions, but in reality, they are conditioned by them. The conditioning happens slowly, quietly, through repetition. The brain does not resist this process. It supports it. Its goal is survival through predictability. Familiar emotional states feel safe even when they are uncomfortable because the brain knows how to manage them. When you try to change your emotional state, the brain often resists. Not because the new state is wrong, but because it is unknown. Chemical states are unpredictable. The brain interprets unpredictability as risk. This is why stepping into joy, confidence, or peace can initially feel unnatural or even uncomfortable. The body hasn't learned how to sustain that state yet, where conscious emotional regulation becomes powerful. When you intentionally choose how you want to feel, independent of external circumstances, you send a new signal. The brain listens carefully. At first, it may question the signal. It may pull you back toward familiar emotions. But with repetition, the brain begins to adapt. Sustaining an elevated emotional state requires presence. You must notice when your emotional state shifts unconsciously and gently guide it back. It's not suppression or denial. It is awareness. When you observe an emotion without identifying with it, the brain receives a new instruction. It learns that emotions can change without danger. As you practice this, body begins to experience new chemical patterns. These patterns feel unfamiliar but energizing. The brain starts to associate them with safety and reward. Over time, the new emotional state becomes easier to access. What once required effort becomes natural. Baseline begins to shift. Emotion also shapes perception. When you live in a certain emotional state, the brain filters information to match it. When you feel anxious, the brain scans for threat. When you feel hopeful, the brain notices possibility. Filtering reinforces the emotional state, creating a loop. Breaking the loop requires changing the emotion first, not the circumstances. The brain learns most effectively through experience. When you generate a new emotional state internally and sustain it, brain treats it as real experience. It records it. It builds reference points. It starts to expect that state again. This is how internal practice becomes external change. Over time, the emotional memory of the future can become stronger than the emotional memory of the past. When this happens, the brain begins to reorganize priorities. Old triggers lose their power. Old reactions soften. The nervous system stabilizes. You are no longer defined by emotional patterns that were built unconsciously. This does not mean emotions disappear. It means they become signals rather than drivers. You feel them without being pulled by them. The brain becomes more flexible, more adaptive, responds instead of reacts. This flexibility is a sign of growth. Living in a chosen emotional state trains the brain to expect better outcomes. Expectation influences behavior. Behavior influences experience. The cycle begins internally and moves outward. Brain follows the strongest signal, and emotion is one of the strongest signals you can provide. When you consistently feel into a future emotional state, the brain begins to treat it as familiar. Familiarity reduces resistance. Resistance dissolves. Action becomes aligned. The internal and external worlds start to synchronize. Your emotional state is not a response to life, it is an instruction to the brain. The brain listens carefully, constantly adjusting chemistry, perception, behavior match the emotional environment you cultivate. When you take responsibility for that environment, you stop being conditioned by the past and start conditioning the future, while the brain continues adapting, learning, following the emotional signals you repeatedly generate moment by moment as the internal state becomes the foundation for a new way of being, reshaping identity, perception, and experience from within steadily, subtly, continuously. Process unfolds and the brain remains attentive, responsive, and aligned with the emotional instructions it receives again and again without pause, without finality, continuing as awareness remains present and intention remains active, guiding the system forward into unfamiliar but intentional states of balance, clarity, and coherence while the internal chemistry shifts, the neural patterns adjust, and the emotional baseline continues evolving, still forming, still stabilizing, still becoming. The brain listens and responds. Your future is not something your brain waits to discover. It is something your brain prepares for in advance. Long before events unfold, the brain is already rehearsing outcomes based on what you consistently think, feel, expect. Expectation is the most powerful instructions you give your brain. It tells the nervous system what to look for, what to anticipate, and how to organize perception and behavior before anything actually happens. The brain is a prediction machine. Passing past experiences to estimate what is most likely to occur next. When you repeatedly expect the same type of outcome, the brain assumes that outcome is relevant. It adjusts posture, attention, emotional tone, decision-making to match that expectation. Over time, expectation becomes preparation, and preparation quietly influences results. Most people are unaware that they are living from rehearsed futures. They expect based on memory. The brain uses yesterday to predict tomorrow, and the body follows that prediction as if it were already true. This creates a loop where the future looks like the past, not because it has to, but because the brain has been trained to expect nothing else. Expectation shapes perception. When you expect difficulty, the brain highlights obstacles. When you expect rejection, the brain searches for signs of it. When you expect progress, the brain notices momentum. These filters operate automatically. You are not consciously choosing them. The brain selects what fits the expectation and ignores what doesn't, shaping reality before you even realize it. This is why hope without alignment does not last. You hope change but continue to expect the same outcomes. The brain follows expectation, not desire. Desire is weak without repetition. Expectation is strong because it is familiar. The brain trusts what it knows. To change expectation, give the brain repeated evidence internally before the external world reflects it. Mental rehearsal plays a critical role here. When you consistently imagine future experiences with clarity and emotion, the brain treats them as training. Neural networks as if the experience were already happening. The body responds with corresponding chemistry. The brain then stores this as a reference point, something it now recognizes as possible. Emotional tone of the imagined future is stronger than the emotional memory of the past. The brain begins to shift allegiance. It starts predicting differently. It prepares you to act in alignment with that future. Preparation shows up subtly in behavior, confidence, timing, and decision-making. Expectation also influences resilience. When you expect growth, challenges are interpreted as feedback rather than failure. The brain responds with curiosity instead of threat. Stress chemistry decreases. Problem solving increases. The same situation produces a different internal response because the expectation has changed. The brain resists expectations that feel unrealistic or unsupported. This resistance is not sabotage, protection. To work with the brain, expectations must be built gradually through repetition and emotional coherence. Each time you align thought, emotion, and intention toward a future state, you strengthen its credibility in the brain's eyes. Expectation stabilizes, behavior shifts naturally. You don't force change, you embody it. The brain begins to guide you toward actions that match the expected outcome. Opportunities become noticeable. Choices become clearer. Energy becomes more available. is not coincidence. It is alignment. The nervous system plays a role in sustaining expectation. A regulated nervous system allows the brain to remain open to new predictions. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, the brain defaults to old expectations because they feel safer. This is why intercom supports change. Safety allows flexibility. Expectation also shapes identity. When you consistently expect yourself to respond a certain way, the brain builds it into your self-concept. You begin to see yourself as capable, adaptable, or resilient because the brain has rehearsed those responses internally. Identity then reinforces expectation, creating a powerful upward cycle. Living from a new expectation does not mean denying present reality. It means interpreting reality differently. The brain can hold awareness of what is while preparing for what is becoming. This dual awareness keeps you grounded while moving forward. Over time, future you have been rehearsing internally begins to feel familiar. Familiarity reduces fear. Fear reduction allows action. Action creates experience. Experience reinforces expectation. The loop completes itself. Brain is always leaning toward the future you expect most consistently. It listens to patterns, not promises. It responds to repetition, not intensity alone. When you take responsibility for expectation, you begin shaping outcomes before they arrive. How intention becomes trajectory. This is how inner rehearsal becomes outer reality. The brain remains attentive, responsive, and adaptive, constantly updating its predictions based on the signals you provide, organizing perception and behavior around the future. You continue to expect moment by moment as internal alignment deepens, as anticipation replaces reaction, as awareness guides attention forward while the brain keeps listening, preparing, responding to the version of tomorrow you are quietly teaching it to believe in. Again and again, through consistent expectation, emotional coherence, and conscious inner direction, as the process continues unfolding, still active, still evolving, shaping what comes next, without pause, without closure, while the future remains in formation inside the mind that is preparing. Now bring all of this back to one simple awareness. Nothing you've heard is abstract, distant, or meant only for certain people. This happened inside you right now. Your brain is listening in every quiet moment, every repeated thought, every emotional reaction, every expectation you hold about yourself and your life. It has been listening your entire life, faithfully following the instructions it was given, never questioning whether those instructions were conscious or inherited, empowering or limiting. The moment you realize this, responsibility replaces blame. You stop waiting for the world to change before you do. You stop handing your power to circumstances, people, or the past. You understand that transformation does not begin with effort on the outside, but with awareness on the inside, one thought at a time, one emotional shift at a time, one moment of presence where you choose differently than you did before. Change does not require perfection. It requires consistency. The brain does not need grand gestures. It responds to repeated signals. Each time you interrupt an old pattern, each time you choose a thought aligned with growth instead of habit, you are teaching your brain a new language. And with enough repetition, that language becomes fluent. You are not trying to become someone new. You are unlearning what no longer serves you and remembering what was always possible. As your thoughts align, your emotions follow. As your emotions stabilize, your actions change. As your actions change, your life begins to reflect a different internal order. So listen carefully to what you think next, not tomorrow, not someday, now. Because your brain is listening, your body is responding, and your future is being shaped in this very moment. To meet it,